increased faster than the cultivated land. For example, the population of Derevskaya district, Pyatina, grew by 16% between the two censuses, the 1480s and around 1500, while the amount of cultivated land increased by only 6%. The peasant land ratio in this district was only 7 desyatins, half of what was typical of the neighboring Shalonskaya district. Archaeological studies indicate that the density of settlements in Derevskaya district during this period, 1480 to 1500, was higher than at any time in the past. Konetsky, 1992-43. Heavy clay soils, never used before, were brought into cultivation. Agricultural intensification is also indicated by the increasing use of fertilizers, which became widespread during this period. Shapiro, 1987:6-14. CHAPTER 8244. 8.3 Stagflation, 1530 to 65. Population and Economy. Chester Dunning, 1997-1998-2001, was the first to use the demographic structural theory in the analysis of Russian history during the 16th century. He noted that population growth beyond the means of subsistence in Russia during the 16th century led to price inflation, in this following the conclusions of earlier studies. C. Bloom, 1956, Mironov, 1985. Before 1530, the price of grain remained relatively stable, with rye costing around 10 denga per quarter, 6 grams of silver per quintal. AHNWR, 1971-21-22. During the 1530s, prices began to increase. For example, in 1532, the price of rye in the Iosifo-Volokolamsky monastery, between Moscow and Tver, was 22 dengas per quarter. During 1543 to 44, as a result of crop failure, the price increased to 35 to 40 dengas. Mankov, 1951, 104. Tracing the connection between overpopulation and inflation, however, is complicated by an uneven regional development. Thus, the earliest signs of stagflation appeared in the northwest, well before they turned up in the central region around Moscow. Before annexation by Moscow, the Novgorod land was dominated by large landowners, who exacted heavy rents from their dependent peasants, up to half the crop. After the annexation, in-kind rents were converted to money rents for the state peasants, significantly lightening the burden on them. On lands given to the military Sir Weissman, Pomesty, however, the press on peasants changed little and sometimes even increased. AHNWR 1971, 173, 373. Thus, peasants working the land belonging to the gentry had to pay heavy rents of 10 to 12 puds, 180 kilograms, per person. According to the calculations of historians, grain production on gentry-owned lands in the first half of the 16th century in Vodskaya and Derevskaya districts, after deducting the rent, was unable to provide the minimal level of per capita consumption, 15 puds or 250 kilograms, AHNWR 1971:3:178. Low levels of personal consumption exposed the population to greater risk of mortality during periodic crop failures. Additionally, the chroniclers noted that in the northwest, epidemics were particularly severe. ANWR 1971:2:33, Soloviev 1989:3:312. Finally, many peasants may have responded to the increasing exactions of the gentry by flight. As a result, between 1500 and 1540, the population of Vodskaya district declined by 17%, and in the Derevskaya region by 13%, AHNWR 1971:2:. In the most populated regions, thus, stagflation had already begun in the early 16th century, and this process was speeded up by the high levels of extraction by the state and the gentry. At the same time, there was significant variation, even within the northwest. The conditions in RUSSIA, THEMUSCOVYCYCLE 245, Bezhetskaya and Shalonskaya districts were more benign than in Derevskaya and Vodskaya districts. The first two districts increased in population between 1500 and 1540. In some locations, the population grew by 27 to 45%. HNWR 1971, 2, 32 to 33, 42 to 35, 291 to 91. Stagflation was spatially heterogeneous, and some districts suffered from it more than others. Documentary sources are much sparser in the central regions, but here too, population growth led to the diminution of peasant land allotments. By the middle of the 16th century, there were instances where 2 or even 3 peasant households were sharing the standard allotment of 15 desyatins. Kolicheva, 1987-64. At this time, an average household in Borisovskaya district, near Vladimir, had 7.5 desyatins, less than in Derevskaya district. Kolicheva, 1987:64. In Belozersky district, the average peasant household had only 6 desyatins, an insufficient amount to produce enough grain to last until the next harvest. Prokopeva, 1967-102. Overpopulation led to chronic peasant indebtedness. Peasants borrowed from the monasteries, the chief money-lending institution in Russia during this period, and when they could not repay their debts, they lost their land. As a result, land held by the Russian Orthodox Church grew dramatically, and toward the mid-16th century the Church owned an estimated 1/3 of all cultivated land in Russia. Zimin, 1960-80. In the mid-16th century, after a long hiatus, famines and epidemics reappeared in Russia. In 1548-49, there was famine in the north. Mankov, 1951-31. In 1552, Novgorod and Pskov experienced a terrible epidemic. In Pskov, 30,000 people died. In 1556-57, there was another famine in the north, and also in the Trans-Volga region. Peasants left the regions affected by famine and migrated south. By the end of the 1550s, 40% of formerly cultivated land along the Dvina River was abandoned. Kolicheva, 1987-172-174. Kolicheva, 1987:172, characterizes the situation as a highly unstable equilibrium, precisely what we would expect during the late stages of stagflation. The first signs of the impending crisis are thus observable well before the start of the Livonian War, 1557-82, which is often blamed by historians for the economic decline of northern Russia in the second half of the 16th century. Russia at that time was not a tightly unified economic system. At the same time as the north suffered from overpopulation and its attendant evils, central Russia was still in relatively good shape. In the Trans-Moscow land, for example, population growth continued until 1560, although all cultivable lands had already been brought under the plough. Ivina, 1985-233. In 1560-61, however, the Trans-Moscow land experienced a famine. Grain prices rose from 10 dengas per quarter 30 years earlier to 50 to 60 dengas, from 6 to 26 to 31 grams of silver per quintal. The CHAPTER 8246. Monks of the Iosifo-Volokolamsky monastery blamed the dearth of land and increased state exactions for this calamity. Ivina, 1985-166. Population growth in the central regions drove the real wages down. In 1520, a day labourer earned 11 kilograms of grain, in real equivalents, while in 1568 his pay was only 3.6 kilograms per day. Nefedov, 2003. In other words, the real wage declined during this half-century by a factor of 3, reflecting population growth beyond the available means of production. A daily wage of 3.6 kilograms may appear sufficient for subsistence, but we need to take into account that day labourers were hired for restricted periods of time, so that most of the time they were unemployed. Even if we assume a very generous 200 days of paid work per year, a standard assumption for Western Europe, the yearly income would work out to only 720 kilograms of grain, which was not even enough to support 3 persons in Russia. In reality, the period of employment in Russia, given its severe climate, was less. For example, in the late 19th century, the summer pay of day labourers was 3 times the daily rate at which labourers hired on a yearly basis were paid. Nefedov, 2003. Monastery records provide us with information about real wages for workers hired year-round. The pay of agricultural labourers consisted of an in-kind portion, which equaled 16 puds, or 262 kilograms of grain, and a cash portion, obrok, which in the 1550s was 80 dengas, equals 118 kilograms of grain. Thus, in real terms, the yearly pay was 380 kilograms, not enough to support even 2 people. Later we observe such a low level of real wages during the severe famine of 1588-89. In other words, the level of consumption during the decade of the 1550s
was as poor as during famine years. Nefedov, 2003. Other indicators of overpopulation and rural underemployment are the flowering of crafts, increased trade, and growing urbanization. Peasants of the densely populated Derevskaya and Vodskaya districts of the Novgorod land could not grow enough grain to support their families, and many of them became small-scale traders and artisans. As a result, numerous settlements appeared in these districts that specialized in handicrafts and trade. Bernatsky, 1961, 108, AHNWR, 1971, 117 to 118. By the beginning of the 16th century, Novgorod had become a substantial city with 5,500 households and about 30,000 inhabitants, 6,000 of whom were craftsmen. In other words, almost all of the male adult population were craftsmen. Tihomirov, 1962, 303 to 7. Pskov, similarly to Novgorod, had more than 6,000 households and a population of 30,000. Zimin, 1972, 120. 17 churches were built in Pskov between 1516 and 1533, almost as many as in Moscow. Zimin, 1972, 123, which, according to the official census, had 41,500 households. Herberstein, 1988, 10% of the population of the Novgorod land lived in cities, which was probably the upper limit of urbanization given the low agricultural productivity characterizing this region and period. Both Novgorod and Pskov were repeatedly hit by EPR-US-SIA, THEM-US-TOV-CYCLE 247.
Epidemics. During the reign of Basil III, 1505 to 33, the chronicles mention at least 4 epidemics in the north, whereas there is no mention of disease in central Russia. AHNWR 1971:2:3, Soloviev 1989:3:312. Elite dynamics. The top level of the Russian social hierarchy was occupied by the appanage princes, who were close relatives of the Moscow rulers. Basil II, Ivan III, and Basil III devoted much energy to reducing the appanages belonging to their relatives, but then they bestowed new ones on their junior sons, which tended to perpetuate the appanage system. After a series of victories of Ivan III over Lithuania, a number of Lithuanian princes transferred their allegiance to Moscow. These noble houses, such as the Vorotinskys, Odoevskys, and Trubetskoys, were considered equal in status to the Apanaga princes. The second level of the hierarchy was occupied by service princes, who included many descendants of the great princes who ruled the Vladimir Suzdal land before the rise of Moscow. Their ancestors voluntarily subordinated themselves to Moscow and often continued as governors of their ancestral lands after these were annexed by Moscow. The third level consisted of the old Muscovite boyars, such as Morozovs, Zaharins, and Chelyadins. The ancestors of these boyars were the closest henchmen of the Moscow princes, when Moscow was still one of the small principalities in the Vladimir Suzdal land. The old Muscovite boyars traditionally occupied the most important positions in government, the equivalent of modern ministries. The princes and boyars together made up the magnate stratum of Muscovite Russia. Below them were the gentry, Dvoryanai I Deti Boyarsky, who served as mounted warriors in the Russian armies. The gentry were further stratified into those who were based in Moscow, the middle-rank elites, and the rest, who were based in the provinces. Many of the provincial servicemen were quite poor. They had land with 4 or 5 peasant households, or even fewer, and their lifestyle differed little from that of the peasants among whom they lived. The overall size of the elite stratum is hard to estimate, but we know that the number of gentry cavalrymen who served on the Oka defensive line during the 1520s was 20,000, table 8.2. Thus, there must have been at least that many military elite households. During the first half of the 16th century, the Moscow rulers encouraged the expansion of gentry cavalry, who provided the bulk of the army. As a result, the number of gentry servicemen grew very substantially, though we lack reliable data to quantify this growth. By the middle of the century, the stocks of available land with peasants that could be granted CHAPTER 8248. Table 8.2. Some numerical data indicating elite dynamics from various sources. Period total source: 1520s. 20,000 Southern Frontier Army, Herberstein, 1988 113, 1560s 100,000 to 120,000, total Muscovite army, Skrinnikov, 1988, 1580s. 65,000, Southern Frontier Army Fletcher, 2003 77 to 78, 1580s. 80,000 total Muscovite Army Fletcher, 2003 77 to 78. 1,630 15,000 Southern Frontier Army Chernov, 1954, 125. 1,630 27,000 all servitors Chernov, 1954, 125. 1,651 39,000 all servitors Chernov, 1954, 125. 1,723,000 gentry owning peasants Vodarsky, 1977, 49, 64, 73. 1737 46,000 gentry owning peasants Vodarsky, 1977. Table 8.3 Percent of gentry servitors in the Novgorod land with estates less than 150 desyatins, between 150 and 300 desyatins, or more than 300 desyatins. 1500-1540. Year 150 до 150 až 300 desetin. 300 до 1,500 22 30 48. 1,540 39 39 22. To new servitors were exhausted. In 1500, land granted to the gentry on condition of military service, pomesti, constituted 58% of arable land in Shelonskaya district of the Novgorod land, but in 1540 it was 98% of the total. Similarly, in Bezhetskaya district, this proportion grew to 99% by 1544. Chernov, 1954, 25. As the number of elite servicemen increased, the average size of their land allotments declined. Table 8.3. Sociopolitical instability? We can follow the dynamics of sociopolitical instability in central Russia by looking at the temporal distribution of coin hoards found in the Moscow region, figure 8.1. After a small peak during the first half of the 15th century, probably reflecting the 15th century crisis. However, the Russian economy at the time was poorly monetized, and the overall number of hoards is too low to make definite conclusions. The number of hoards per decade fluctuated between 0 and 3, reflecting generally orderly conditions in the heartland of the Muscovite state. The first jump in hoard numbers is observed during the 1540s and extends to the end of the century. Then came a huge jump during the time of troubles. Fol R-U-S-S-I-A, T-H-E-M-U-S, C-O-V-Y-C-Y-C-L-E 249. Figure 8.1 time distribution of coin hoards found in the Moscow region, 1400 to 1750. Load by a gradual decline that was interrupted by another upsurge around 1700, followed by a low in the mid-18th century. The course of the narrative history is largely in agreement with the coin hoard dynamics. The reigns of Ivan III, 1462 to 1505, and Basil III, 1505 to 33, were characterized by internal unity and successful territorial expansion. When Basil III died in 1533, his son Ivan IV was only 3 years old. During Ivan IV's minority, the state affairs were first directed by his mother, Helen Glinsky, and after her death in 1538 by the Boyar Duma, the supreme council of the state. The period of Boyar rule, 1538 to 47, was racked by continuous strife between two noble clans, the Schwiskys and the Belskys. Power changed hands several times, and imprisonments, exiles, executions, and murders proliferated. Ryazanovsky, 2045. The Boyars divided the provincial governorships among themselves and sharply increased their demands. Komleny. On the population, Soloviev, 1989, 3436, 440. The magnates interfered in the process of distributing the service estates to the gentry. There is documentary evidence that the princes and the boyars seized large tracts of this land as their own. Kobrin, 1980, 172. The gentry felt themselves squeezed by large landowners, the lay magnates, and the monasteries. Litigation for land between the servitors and monasteries became common during the 1540s. Zimin, 1960, 76, 81. See HAPTER 8250. Figure 8.2 Precedence litigation in Russia, 1500 to 1700. The solid curve shows the dynamic pattern in the database collected by N.S. Coleman. The broken line gives the dynamics in another databases, collected by EU. M. Eskin, both sets of numbers are given in Coleman 1999:138. Another useful indication of intralight competition and fractionation is provided by the dynamics of precedence litigation. Precedence, местничество, was a system of appointments for state positions, based on a hierarchical ranking of boyar families and prior service. Precedence litigations were disputes among the military leaders over service assignments. Coleman, 1999. Before 1540, there were only 3 to 5 litigation cases per decade, but during the 1540s it jumped to 30, in the Coleman database. See the solid curve in Figure 8.2. Another huge jump, to over 200, occurred during the 1580s. Thus, the intensity of precedence litigation seems to provide a good leading indicator of intralight struggles to come. The failure of crops in 1546 led to a famine the following winter. When a great fire swept Moscow in June 1547, it triggered a popular uprising, the first one in the city since the foundation of Moscow Principality. The riot airs wrecked the mansions of many boyars and killed one of the ruling magnates, Yuri Glinsky. The young Tsar Ivan IV took matters into his hands. He repented publicly in Red Square and promised to rule in the interests of the people, Ryazanovsky 2045. In 1549, he convened a Zemsky Sobor, Assembly of the Land, an institution similar to the Estates General, which RUSSIA THEMUSCO FYSYCLE 251. Figure 8.3 Dynamics of State Taxes in Bezhetskaya District, in kilograms of grain per household. Nefedov 2003. Further helped normalize the situation. The first 2 decades of Ivan IV's reign are known as the good half of the reign. Ryazanovsky 2045. The government of Ivan IV undertook reforms of the military and local government and adopted a new law code. Growth of taxation. The good half of Ivan IV's reign also saw prolonged and intense external warfare. On the Eastern Front, Moscow was successful in defeating and annexing the lands of the Kazan and Astrakhan Tatars, 1552–56. On the Western Front, the Livonian War, 1557–82, against the Poles and the Swedes, resulted first in some gains, but it ultimately ended in defeat and loss of territory. Apart from the geopolitical goals of these wars, they also served the purpose of providing the elites, especially the impoverished ones, with employment and booty. These wars were extremely expensive and resulted in a sharp increase of the state's press on peasants, Figure 8.3. As we noted above, peasant consumption in parts of the Novgorod land was already at the minimum sustainable level, 15 puds or 250 kilograms per year, even before the Livonian CHAPT ER 8252. War. Extraction of an additional 3 to 4 PEDs, 60 kilograms of grain, had to result in famine and epidemics. This is indeed what happened in, for example, Derevskaya district, AHNWR 1971-2, Table 36. 8.4 Crisis, 1565–1615. In 1565, Ivan IV created a separate institution called the Oprichnina, from Oprich, a part or beside, that divided the state, the elites, and the whole society right down the middle. Ryazanovsky, 2150. Ivan established a separate administrative structure for the Oprichnina and the rest of the Kaun Trai, the Zemshina, which continued to be governed by the Boyar Duma. There were 2 sets of officials, one for the Oprichnina and another for the Zemshina. The countryside was also divided into 2 parts, and many landlords in the Oprichnina territory were transferred out, while their lands were given to the new servitors of the Tsar, called the Oprichniki. Skrinnikov, 1996, determined that more than 150 magnates, almost all of them of princely status, were removed to the Kazan region. In the beginning there were 1,000 Oprichniki, but eventually their numbers grew to 6,000. Urged on by Ivan IV, the Oprichniki instituted a reign of terror against the boyars, their relatives and associates. A number of towns, the best known of which is Novgorod, were devastated by the Tsar's henchmen. It looked as if a civil war were raging in the Muscovite state, but a peculiar civil war, for the attackers met no resistance. Ryazanovsky 2151. In essence, Oprichnina was a coup d'etat from above, in which Ivan IV used one segment of the elites and elite aspirants to wage civil war against the rest. Once the Oprichniki played their role, they were in turn repressed. In 1572, Ivan declared the oprichnina abolished. It was during this period of intense external and internal conflict, the Livonian War and oprichnina, that Russia experienced a demographic disaster of the first magnitude. The specific trigger was a poor harvest in 1567. By itself, this was not an unusual occurrence. Crops failed in medieval Russia on average every 6 to 7 years. Normally, such bad harvests did not result in a famine, because the peasants kept a year's worth of grain as a precaution. However, the increased press of taxation, figure 8.3, coming on top of an economic system stressed to the brink by overpopulation, meant that peasants could not afford to keep sufficient grain to tide them over a period of dearth. As a result, a major famine developed in the central region during the winter of 1567 to 68. Grain prices increased 8 to 10-fold. The crops failed again in the next year, the prices remained at the same high level, and the famine became worse. Skrinikov, 1975, 162, Kolicheva R.U.S. S.I.A. T.H.E.M. U.S.C.O.V.Y. C.Y.C.L.E. 253.
1987-19. In 1570, famine was followed by the plague. It was one of those terrible epidemics of the Middle Ages that arrive roughly once a century and leave after themselves almost completely depopulated cities and villages, wrote E. I. Kolicheva, 1987-178. The Great Famine continued on during the plague. There were numerous reports of cannibalism, Staden 1925:92. Famine, plague, and intra-elite conflicts weakened the ability of the state to repel external invasions. In 1571, the Crimean Khan Devlet Gire gathered together a huge host and invaded Muscovy. The Tatars attacked and burned Moscow, killing hundreds of thousands of people. The territory around Moscow and south of it was devastated. Skrinikov, 1975:163, Kolicheva, 1987:182. When the Tatars withdrew, they carried away with them 100,000 prisoners to be sold on the slave market of Kaffa. In the late 1570s, the Livonian War entered its final phase, the result of which was the loss of all territories conquered by Moscow earlier in the war, and even loss of some additional towns to the Swedes. The war finally ended with the peace treaties of 1582 with Poland and of 1583 with Sweden. Ryazanovsky, 2152. We can assess the scale of the catastrophe of the 1570s by turning to the best documented region, the Northwest, Nefedov, 2003. In Derevskaya, district 1/3 of peasant allotments, obeji, were deserted owing to the mortality associated with famine and plague. Other allotments were abandoned by peasants unable to fulfill their tax obligations. In Derevskaya district, 3/5 of allotments were deserted, although it is unknown what proportion was due to mortality and what to emigration. Parts of Bezhetskaya district lost 40% of population to famine and disease. Some idea of what happened in the central region can be gained from the conditions on the estates belonging to the Troitse Sergiev and Iosifo-Volokolamsky monasteries. Around Moscow, where the impact of the Tatar invasion was the heaviest, 90% of previously cultivated land was deserted. In Suzdal district, USZ, the proportion of deserted lands was 60%, in Murom district 36%, and in Yuriev-Polsky district 18%. No doubt some of these lands were deserted as a result of peasants moving elsewhere. However, the magnitude of such emigration could not have been very great, because the Muscovite frontiers, where land was abundant, were particularly unsafe during the 1570s. The southern frontier saw 3 major invasions by the nomads, while the Volga region was racked by a rebellion. Thus, there was no region where peasants could move en masse, and it is likely that the numbers we have just cited bear witness to the huge scale of mortality affecting the Russian population during the 1570s, Nefedov 2003, CHAPTER 8254. As usual, the population decline brought in its wake some amelioration of the economic conditions for the commoners. Thus, the daily wage increased sharply during the 1570s. The Vologda labourers in 1576 earned 3 dengas per day, while a quarter of grain cost 23 dengas. The real wage thus was 9.3 kilograms of grain per day, or 2.5 times greater than a decade before.
In Iosifo-Volokolamsky Monastery, the real wage of labourers also grew by a factor of 2.5. The pay of skilled workers, such as carpenters and tailors, grew twofold. Similar wage increases took place in other religious houses, Nefedov 2003. Another sign of decreased population pressure was the fall of land rents, Nefedov 2003. The Kwitrent, Obrok, on the gentry estates fell by a factor of 3, from 10 to 12 to 3 to 4 puds per soul. On the state-owned land, the rents were approximately halved. Corvée obligations also declined by a factor of 2 or 3, Nefedov 2003. Thus, the demographic catastrophe of the 1570s led not to increased levels of peasant exploitation, as some historians have claimed, but, on the contrary, to a significant lightening of the burden. But this also meant that the ability of the state and the elites to extract resources from peasants using economic methods declined in a major way. In real terms, taxes paid by each household shrank 3, 4, or even 5-fold, as in Shelonskaya district around Novgorod. The state revenues from the whole of Novgorod land were halved by 1576, and in 1583 they were only 1/12 the pre-catastrophe level, Vorobev and Degtyarev 1986, 168. The gentry servitors were also hard hit. Many estates completely lacked peasants to work the land. Only 7% of land was cultivated in Moscow district, Uezd, and 25% in Kolomna district. In Derevskaya district, more than a third of servitors had no peasants. AHNWR 1971, :2:71, Kolicheva 1987:184. Lacking resources to support themselves, the gentry abandoned their estates. The Muscovite army, the bulk of which consisted of the mounted gentry servitors, lost half its number, Steden 1925-99, Skrinikov 1988-13. Ivan IV died in 1584. The reign of his son, Fedor, 1584-98, was a relatively peaceful period, even though Fedor was feeble-minded, and the government was again in the hands of the boyars. This interlude between the periods of high political instability, between the Oprichnina, 1565-72, and the time of troubles, 1604-13, was probably due to the exhaustion of potential warring factions, rather than any lasting solution to the basic contradiction between elite overproduction and declining commoner population. The root cause of the continuing instability, which eventually led to the state collapse and civil war, known in Russian history as the Time of True Bliss, was an acute shortage of labor, the economic distress of the elites, and the financial crisis of the state. The situation was similar to that of Western RUS SIA, THEM US COVYCYCLE 255. Europe after the Black Death, see chapters 2 and 4, where the decrease in the supply of labor that drove wages up and rents down induced the nobility to employ extra-economic, coercive methods in an attempt to maintain their revenues. In England and France, these attempts failed, while in Poland and Prussia, the elites were successful in enserfing the peasants. See discussion in section 1.1. 2 centuries later in Russia, under similar conditions, the elites were also able to impose serfdom on the peasants. However, enserfment could not resolve the economic problems of the elites. During the reign of Fedor, 1584-98, the Russian army consisted of 80,000 cavalrymen who received annual pay in addition to service estates. Every year, 65,000 cavalrymen served on the southern frontier, guarding against the Tatar raids. Not all of these warriors were gentry, but on the other hand, not all gentry received salary. Thus, by the end of the 16th century, there were at least 3 times as many gentry servitors than in the reign of Basil III, 1505-33, when 20,000 cavalrymen served on the steppe frontier. It is reasonable to assume that the overall numbers of the gentry increased by the same factor, 3 or more, whereas the commoner population was roughly the same as under Basil III, owing to the demographic catastrophe of the 1570s. In other words, the social pyramid became extremely top-heavy toward the end of the 16th century. It is clear that Russian peasants could not support such great numbers of the gentry, even if they were deprived of all of the agricultural surplus they produced. This contradiction could be solved only by abating the elite overproduction, which is what happened in the first half of the 17th century. Enserfment was not a discrete event, rather, it was a process that occurred in stages spread out over many decades. A key period in the evolution of serfdom was the end of the reign of Fedor, 1584 to 98, and the reign of Boris Godunov, 1598 to 1605. When the government, under pressure from the gentry, issued a number of legislative acts that restricted the movement of peasants and extended the period during which a fugitive serf could be forcibly returned to his master. Enserfment gave the landowners more power to extract surplus from the peasants. This is, for example, what happened at Yosifo-Voloklamsky Monastery, where the first attempt to increase corvée by 50% met with peasant resistance and had to be rescinded. Koretsky, 1970, 283-84. Peasant History, 1990, 257. Subsequent landlord initiatives were supported by the central authority. In 1601-3, corvée was doubled in many monaster IEs by the Tsar's edicts. Because of fragmentary data, no quantitative statements can be made about the conditions of peasants on the servitor estates. However, we know that petty gentry had very few peasants. For example, the average servitor in Tula province was supported by only 4 peasant households, Koretsky, 1975-86, but he had to equip himself for military service every year, as a CHAPTER 8256. Result, the majority of servitors were compelled to deprive the peasants of all of their surplus, leaving them nothing with which to build up stores in case of recurrent crop failure. The time of troubles. The socio-economic situation in the first decade of the 17th century was in certain respects similar to that of 40 years earlier, although during the 1560s it was the tax press of the state, not the elites, that pushed the peasants to the brink of survival. The trigger again was a very poor harvest resulting from cold and wet weather in 1601. Grain prices started climbing almost immediately. In the spring of 1601, a quarter of rye in the central region cost 30 to 32 dengas, but in the following fall it was already 60 to 70 dengas. In February 1602, the price of grain reached 1 ruble, 200 dengas per quarter. Koretsky, 1975-11 to 19. In 1602, many peasants lacked viable seeds to sow the fields, because the early frosts in 1601 damaged the grain before it was harvested. In the fall, grain prices reached 3 rubles per quarter. The next year, 1603, the weather was good, but the fields were empty of crops and the famine deepened. Skrinnikov, 1988:38. Thus, the catastrophe was not due to 3 years of incessant rains, as some authorities have proposed. In reality, bad weather was a major factor only during the first year of famine. Climate served as a trigger, but the explanation for the length and severity of the catastrophe must be sought in the top-heavy social structure that resulted in the relentless oppression of the productive class by the elites. The Great Famine of 1601-3 had far-reaching effects on the population, the state, and the elites. First, it resulted in vast suffering and an enormous mortality shock delivered to the general population. Avrami Palitzin reported that 127,000 people were buried in Moscow alone, Palitzin, 1955. Another witness wrote that 1/3 of the Muscovite tsardom has perished from the famine, Koretsky, 1975-131. Starving peasants attacked the houses of wealthier peasants and servitor manors. Starting in the fall of 1602, banditry outbreaks became endemic in many regions, Koretsky, 1975:208. Second, it brought about the collapse of the state finances. The government of Boris Godunov went to extraordinary efforts to alleviate the suffering of the common people, Dunning, 2004, 69-70. It attempted to control the prices, but without success. The Tsar then used the state's grain reserves, selling the stored surplus at half the market's price and distributing loaves of bread to the poor free of charge. Finally, the government was forced to spend huge amounts of money by giving away coins and bread to the poor in Moscow, Smolensk, Novgorod, and Pskov. In Moscow, for example, RUSSIA THEMUSCOVYCYCLE 257. Government agents distributed food and money to about 70,000 people every day, a large part of whom had migrated from the surrounding Count Tricide. Eventually, these handouts had to be stopped because of depleted treasury, Dunning, 2004-70. Third, the famine created a huge pool of disaffected and desperate counter-elites. Petty gentry were hit by the famine as badly as peasants. Many of them were forced to sell themselves into slavery in order to survive. In 1602, slave sales were 9 times greater than in normal years. Dunning 2004, 69. The trained cavalrymen who sold themselves into slavery were not employed in agricultural or domestic chores. Instead, they joined the armed retinues of the magnates as elite military slaves. As the famine lengthened, the lords found themselves unable to support their large retinues, and many cut the military slaves adrift. These individuals were desperate, armed and dangerous, and there were very many of them. According to a contemporary estimate, 20,000 former elite military slaves migrated to the southern steppe frontier, where they joined the ranks of disaffected Cossacks and frontier servitors. Dunning 2004, 72. Unemployed military slaves, destitute servitors, runaway serfs, and Cossacks from the southern frontier constituted a huge pool of manpower for the subsequent rebellions and civil wars. The first outbreak, the so-called Klopko Rebellion, was little more than a large band of bandits that operated in the Moscow region in the fall of 1603. Before they were finally suppressed, they managed to defeat the government troops sent against them and kill their commander. The next uprising, in 1604, was more serious and ultimately successful in toppling the state. It was led by an impostor who claimed to be Prince Dmitri, the son of Ivan IV. False Dmitri had started his invasion of Russia with the backing of the Polish magnates, but it is probable that the plot was initiated and secretly supported by certain boyar factions. Busov, 1961, 100. The pretender had drawn most of his army from the southern frontier region, where a large number of frontier Cossacks and servitors had recently been joined by massive influxes of former military slaves, destitute servitors, and runaway serfs. In April 1605, Tsar Boris died suddenly, and the Magnate coalition, which he had until then managed to hold together, fell apart. Large segments of the elites went over to the false Dmitri, and he entered Moscow in triumph in June 1605. We do not need to describe the events of the ensuing civil war in detail. Suffice it to say that Dmitri was overthrown and murdered by a faction of the boyars led by Vasily Shuisky in 1606. Shuisky became Tsar but was deposed in 1610. Meanwhile, a series of pretenders arose one after another, including another Prince Dmitri who claimed to have miraculously escaped the death at the hands of the boyars. There was another popular Chapeter 8258. Rebellion led by Ivan Bolotnikov, and foreign interventions by the Poles and Swedes. At one point, the Russian crown was offered to Władysław, son of the King of Poland. In 1611, the continuing internal infighting and external invasions triggered a powerful unifying response by the Russian elites and people. In 1613, a Zemsky Sobor elected Mikhail Romanov, a scion of a prominent boyar clan, to the throne, thus bringing the time of troubles to an end. The famine ended earlier. 1604 was a good year for the crops. The demographic catastrophe had its usual positive effect on the real wages. Servant wages in monasteries increased by 50% compared to the pre-famine years. Nikolsky, 1910. Rye cost 32 dengas per quarter, which was close to the pre-famine level. Thus, the years of famine and civil war resulted in another population decline, although its magnitude was probably not as great as that of the 1560s and 1570s. A shrinking population led to labor shortages and increased real wages. However, whereas after the first catastrophe, the real wages increased by a factor of 2.5, after the time of troubles, the increase was on the order of 1.5. The situation of the peasants improved, and the process of enserfment was de facto rolled back. Although all the laws tying peasants to land continued to exist, in practice they were unenforceable. It was very difficult to locate and bring back runaway peasants. This was a task beyond the resources of most gentry, and no government agencies existed to give them help. Furthermore, once the situation stabilized, the government did everything to avoid further agitation among the peasants. Shapiro, 1965-67. On the southern frontier, peasants were given a legal right to leave the estates of the gentry. Tikhonov, 1966, 302. The long and intense civil war shrank the elite numbers. If during the 1580s the numbers of cavalrymen who served every year on the southern frontier was 65,000, in 1630 only 15,000 of elite servitors were able to report for the frontier duty, Table 8.2. 8.5 Conclusion. The end of the internecine warfare around 1450 created favourable conditions for sustained population growth. The second half of the 15th century was characterized by abundant land, relatively high consumption levels by the peasants, low grain prices, high real wages, and low levels of craft development and urbanization. Internal peace and order prevailed, while externally the state was involved in a series of successful wars of expansion. RUSSIA THEMUSCO VYCY CLE 259. The first signs of stagflation become visible in the Novgorod land by the early 16th century, but in the central region they appear only toward the middle of the century. The stocks of free land for internal colonization had been depleted, and land-peasant ratios became increasingly low, leading to high grain prices and low real wages and consumption standards. Reports of famines and epidemics became frequent in the chronicles. Peasants migrated toward cities in increasing numbers. Towns and cities grew in population, and trade and crafts flowered. Intra-elite competition and fragmentation increased in the middle of the 16th century. The increase in the social tensions is manifested in the government's attempts at social reforms and in decreasing socio-political stability, for example, the Moscow Revolt, 1547, and the Oprichnina of Ivan IV, 1565-72. The stress of the Livonian War motivated the government to increase the tax burden beyond a sustainable level. Extraction not only of the surplus, but of the resources needed for peasant reproduction brought the system to the point of collapse. The triggering event was 2 consecutive years of bad harvests, 1567 and 1568. Since previous state exaction had left peasants no safety cushion, these natural calamities resulted in a terrible famine. Famine was followed by an epidemic and a disastrous external invasion by the Crimean Tatars. These factors together resulted in the population collapse of 1568-71. The severe population decline resulted, as usual, in better standards of life for the commoners. However, the numbers of elites remained very high. Better wages and lower rents, combined with a smaller producing population, led to a drastic decrease in elite incomes. The elite landed servitors were the mainstay of the Russian army, but at this point the majority of them were unable to equip themselves and serve on the frontier. The government was thus forced to bind the peasants to land in order to give the servitors better ability to increase the rents. Encirclement resulted in a significant increase in the level of resource extraction from the peasants, especially by petty servitors who had only a few peasants to support themselves. The socio-political instability of the 1560s and 1570s was followed by a relatively peaceful interlude in the 1580s and 1590s. During this period, the population probably increased, but it was still far below the pre-crisis level. Thus, the basic contradiction between too many elite servitors and too few peasants was unresolved. The press of the landlords on the peasants resulted in the latter existing precariously on the verge of starvation, lacking any reserves in case of a poor harvest. The crop failure of 1601 triggered another massive famine. During the following 3 years, the general population experienced massive mortality. The state depleted the treasury while unsuccessfully trying to ameliorate the effects of the famine, and huge CHAPTER 8260. Numbers of trained and equipped military personnel were left without any means of subsistence. The result was a bloody and prolonged civil war known as the Time of Troubles. This internal struggle resulted in a reduction in elite numbers, but social equilibrium was not entirely attained. The second demographic catastrophe resulted in another population drop and an increase in the quality of life for the peasants, while elite incomes again declined. Thus, the economic position of the elites after the Time of Troubles remained difficult. Chapter 9. Russia, the Romanov Cycle, 1620 to 1922. 9.1 Expansion, 1620 to 1800. Population and economy. The Time of Troubles delivered a terrible blow to Russia. Judging by Census data, the population of the Novgorod land in 1620 was half that in 1582, and 1/10 that in 1500. On the estates of the Troitse Sergiev monastery, scattered over all central Russia, the cultivated area shrank by a factor of 10. Only 1/8 of the arable area in the Moscow region was actually cultivated, according to the population census of 1626-29. Of the rest, some was left fallow, but most sprouted forest, Gotti 1937, 115 to 116, Degtyarev 1980, 170, Vodarsky 1988:54, AHNWR 1989:11. These regions, however, were the ones that experienced the worst devastation from the Livonian War and the times of troubles, and the total population of Russia declined to a lesser degree. The Russian census of 1646 counted 551,000 peasant households and 31,000 urban households. Vodarsky 1973:26. Assuming 6 persons per household and correcting for the undercount, which Vodarsky estimated as 25%, we have an estimate of 4.5 to 5 million. Vodarsky 1973. Kopanev 1959 estimated that in the 1550s the population of Russia was 9 to 10 million. Thus, the intervening crisis reduced the population approximately by half. Economic expansion gradually resumed during the 1620s. To a very large degree, it was made possible by building the 800-kilometer-long Belgorod defensive line that protected the southern frontier region from the Tatar raids. Farther south, the fertile Black Earth region started to be colonized in the mid-17th century. The opening of the new fertile lands for peasant colonization from the central regions was a factor of huge importance for the subsequent history of Russia, because it removed the threat of overpopulation until the far future, and resulted in an abnormally long expansion phase. Between 1646 and 1678, the size of the population, not counting the population in the annexed lands, increased from 4.5 to 5 million to 8.6 million. During this period, the population of the Novgorod land more than. Following the practice of Russian historians, all dates in this chapter are given in the old style. CHAPTER 9262, doubled, although still remaining a third lower than the level achieved in 1500. Vodarsky 1973, 26 to 28, AHNWR 1989, Table 4. Population growth was particularly rapid in the south. By 1678, the population of the Black Earth region had increased to 1.8 million people, compared to 3.5 million in the central region. The south became an important supplier of grain for the central region. By the end of the 1670s, this region was exporting 1 million PDs, 16,400 tons, of grain, and government officials repeatedly and approvingly reported the growth of the grain supply that helped to reduce the prices. Vazhinsky 1963-9. Beginning with 1719, we dispose of detailed data on population dynamics, which were obtained by the so-called revisions, regular censuses of the taxed population. When considering these numbers, it is important to take into account the substantial growth of the territory of the Russian state. To gain a better insight into the demographic dynamics, we will focus on the area that was encompassed by the revision of 1719, while excluding the territories that were gained later: Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic regions. The population of the central region, which includes the Moscow, Vladimir, Yaroslavl, Kostroma, Nizhny Novgorod, Tver, and Kaluga provinces, grew much slower than the population of the Black Earth region, the Tula, Ryazan, Kursk, Orlov, Voronezh, Tambov, and Penza provinces. Figure 9.1. Population growth rates fluctuated, and the general picture of rapid increase was punctuated by periods of much slower growth. As we discuss below, population growth slowdowns were a result not of overpopulation, but of the occasional redistribution of resources in the state elite. Commoners' system. For example, the crisis of the 1720s and 1730s was the result of a sharp increase in the tax pressure under Peter I that caused the famine of 1723 to 25. It has been estimated that around 300,000 people, or 3% of the total population, perished during this famine. The structural crisis of the 1780s was caused by an abrupt increase in the rent, which led to the famine of 1787 to 88. Nefedov 2005, 151, 182 to 83. An abundance of free land suitable for cultivation meant that peasants were not stimulated to pursue crafts or migrate to towns. For this reason, the cities grew very slowly during the 17th century. Russian towns during this period served primarily defensive and administrative functions rather than being economic centers. Among town inhabitants, the various kinds of servitors, gentry, musketeers, or Cossacks, heavily outnumbered craftsmen and traders. Vodarsky, 1966:279-89, estimated that the total urban population of 247,000 males in 1652 encompassed 139,000 servitors, and Sto Osam Hiljada Posadsky Lyudi, people who pursued crafts and trade. The situation was much the same in 1678. 149,000 servitors and 134,000 craftsmen, tradesmen. RUS. SIA. THER Omen OVCYCLE 263. Figure 9.1. Rates of population growth in the Central and Black Earth regions, 1719 to 1897. Data from Rashin, 1956-44-45, Table 19, and Cabazan, 1971a, Appendix I. Slow urban growth persisted in the 18th century, and the military continued to be a substantial component of urban population. Between 1719 and 1796, the urban population, within the 1719 boundaries, grew by only 34%. In the more populated central region, urban growth was more substantial, 61%. According to the calculations of Mironov, 1990-65-71, the rate of population growth between 1743 and 1783 was 0.84% per year. The growth rate due to migration from the rural areas was only 0.04%, and the bulk of the growth, 0.8% per year, came from a natural increase in the urban population. The rural population grew much faster, and, as a result, the share of the total population living in cities and towns shrank from 11.5% during the 1740s to 7.1% in the 1830s. Contemporary sources indicate that during the 17th century, peasants were quite well off. Yuri Kryzhanich, 1997:261-286, noted that Russian peasants lived much better than in the Greek, Spanish, and other similar lands, where either meat or fish are very dear, while firewood is sold by weight. Adam Olearius, 1980:329, testified that there was a great abundance of grain and pasture, and large stocks of free cultivable land, and that in Russia one rarely heard about dearth. Statistical data from several regions support the reports of Western travelers in Russia. Gorfunkel, 1962:117, who studied the economy of Kirillo Chapter 9264. Belozersky Monastery considered the period after the time of troubles the golden age of the monastery's peasants. According to the estimates of Kolesnikov, 1976:301, the average amount of crops gathered per capita in Totem District, Uezd, in northern Russia was 460 to 520 kilograms. In the 1680s to 1690s, an average household in certain monasteries in central Russia had between 2 and 5 horses. Peasant households on the gentry land owned on average of 2.2 to 2.6 horses and 1 or 2 cows. Peasant History, 1990-17. In Starorusky district during the 1660s, an average household owned 2 to 3 horses and 4 to 5 cows. AHNWR, 1989, 126-134. An average household of the Pskovo-Pechorsky Monastery in 1639 consisted of 5 to 6 people, 3 to 4 horses, and 4 cows. Peasant History, 1994, 117. Even peasants who in the 1660s fled from the centre to the south were not paupers. A typical household owned 3 horses and 2 cows. Novoselsky, 1945-60. We are on even firmer ground when we consider the data on the real wages of rural workers. In the years 1640 to 47, the daily pay of an unskilled worker was 9 kilograms of grain. During the 1660s and 1670s, price inflation reduced it to 6 kilograms. But by the end of the century, grain prices had fallen, and the real wage grew to 14 kilograms. Nefedov, 2005, 115. This was a very substantial level of consumption, similar to that of European peasants at the end of the 15th century. Abel 1973, 189 to 92. This favorable consumption level was not exceeded in Europe until the 19th century. During the 18th century, consumption levels gradually declined. This trend is most starkly evidenced by the anthropometric data collected by Boris Mironov, 2004, according to which the average height of army recruits declined by 4 centimeters during the century, figure 9.2. The decreasing tendency was not monotonic, however. For example, there was apparently a severe drop in the quality of life during the 1710s and 1720s. But during the next 3 decades, the nutrition situation ameliorated, probably cause of the increasing pace of colonization of the Black Earth region. In the second half of the century, the standard of living declined again. A particularly severe decrease occurred during the crisis of the 1780s. Another important indicator of population growth is the price of grain, figure 9.3. During the reign of Peter I, prices increased threefold. The end of the reign, 1723 to 25, saw famine and structural crisis. After that, prices declined, and the general conditions became more favorable, though there was another famine in 1733 to 35. During the 1740s and 1750s, prices stabilized at a low equilibrium as a result of the regular flow of grain from the Black Earth region. A new period of inflation began in the 1760s, resulting in an abrupt jump in prices during the famine of 1766 to 68, which was made worse by rising rents. Finally, increasing demands on peasants by the gentry at the end of the 18th century did not permit the Ps RUSSIA THER OM AN OV CYCLE 265. Figure 9.2 Average height of army recruits, plotted by year of birth, compared with population numbers within the constant area of the first census. Data from Mironov, 2004, Table 4, and Cabazan, 1971a. Figure 9.3 The price of 1 pud of rye in the central region in grams of silver, after Mironov, 1985. CHAPTER 9266. Ants to build up stores of grain during the good years. The result was the structural crisis of 1787 to 88. The overall trend of price change during the 18th century thus fits the pattern predicted by the demographic structural theory. However, prices grew not monotonically, but in spurts, because they were affected not only by population increase, but also by the colonization of the Black Earth region and by the currency manipulations of the government, which introduced copper and paper money. The influence of the money supply was very substantial, because the amount of money circulating per capita of population increased during the 18th century several-fold. We can take this monetary inflation into account by dividing the nominal price index by the index of currency circulation per capita, figure 9.4. The normalized price index, figure 9.4, suggests that the real fall in prices during the 1750s was much greater than suggested by figure 9.3. In other words, the organization of grain transportation from the Black Earth region had a very real effect on grain prices in the central region. This effect, nevertheless, was a temporary one, and by the end of the 18th century, continuing population growth had pushed the grain prices to a new peak. The elites, the confiscations of Ivan IV and the time of troubles delivered a heavy blow to the votchina, allodial possessions of the boyars and the gentry. In Tver district, for example, in 1548, there were 318 votchinas, averaging 370 desiatins of arable land. In the 1620s, by contrast, there remained 197 votchinas, with an average size of 137 desiatins. Thus, the overall area of allodial lands shrank by a factor of 4.3. In the central region, an average votchina had only 4.2 peasant households. Shvatenko, 1990, 29, 189. The Pomesty landowning system, estates held in return for service, also was in crisis, not because of a lack of land, but because there were not enough peasants to work it. The estates of the wealthiest gentry, those based in Moscow, had on average 24 male peasants, including unmarried ones. In the provinces, the conditions were much less favorable. In Shelonskaya district, in 1626-27, an average gentry servitor possessed 3.8 households with 6.2 male souls, and 35% of estates had no peasants at all, Vorobev and Degtyarev, 1986, 47, 48, 138. The combined effect of having fewer peasants and a 2 to 3-fold decline in the quit rents meant that the gentry incomes were only 1/10 the level of a century before. The Swedish diplomat Peter Petraeus reported that right after the time of troubles, the gentrymen could not afford leather shoes and had to wear laptai, peasant shoes woven from straw. Kliuchevsky, 1991-86. The gentry numbers declined. As we noted in the previous chap, RUS, SIA, THER, and OVCYCLE, 267. Figure 9.4, normalized index of grain prices for the central region, obtained by dividing the nominal price index by the index of currency in circulation per capita. TIR, the nominal size of the gentry cavalry during the 1580s, was 80,000, of which 65,000 actually served every year on the frontier. The comparable numbers for 1630 were 27,000 and 15,000. Chernoff, 1954, 125. Although the gentry numbers experienced a dramatic decline, the socio-economic balance between the strata was not yet regained. The gentry incomes remained very low, and the gentry servitors insisted on more effective control over peasants, which meant establishing serfdom. During the 1640s, the gentry obtained what they wanted. Serfdom was fully instituted in Russia with the Ulozhenie Law Code of 1649. Tikhonov, 1974, 202, argued that the imposition of serfdom immediately led to the growth of barshina, corvée, which was one of the chief causes of the rebellion headed by Stepan Razin, 1670-71. The uprising in turn forced the gentry to decrease barshina. Here we note the interesting parallelism between the events that followed the imposition of serfdom in the 1590s and 1650s. In both cases, increased pressure by the gentry on peasants triggered popular uprisings. However, the outcome of the peasant rebellions was very difficult. Unlike during the time of troubles, the elites were not divided during the 1670s, and the state was relatively strong. As a result, the uprising of the Cossacks and peasants was speedily suppressed by the government forces. Nevertheless, in both cases, the peasant resistance resulted in at least a temporary setback in the ability of the landowning elites to extract surplus from the peasants. C. H. APTER 9268. Economic conditions were also an important factor in determining the dynamics of surplus extraction. During the long and difficult war with Poland, 1654-67, the government attempted to solve its financial problems by minting large quantities of copper money, which resulted in inflation and a rapid growth in grain prices. Trade disruption, a fall in the real value of quitrents because of inflation, and increased expenditures forced the gentry to increase barshina. The post-war normalization of economic conditions, however, allowed the elites to decrease barshina and replace it with the quitrent, Nefedov, 2005. In the final analysis, the imposition of serfdom did not lead to heavier corvée demands on peasant labor. The quitrent also did not increase in nominal terms, although declining grain prices led to an increase in real terms to 3.5 to 4 puds per sol. The real gain of the landowning elites was not from any increases in the rent, but from their ability to increase the number of peasants on their estates, as a result of new legal barriers preventing peasant escape. In the Novgorod land, for example, the average number of male peasants per gentry estate increased from 15 in 1646 to 26 in 1678. As we discussed above, in the mid-17th century, a substantial proportion of gentry did not have peasants, odnodvortsi, or single holders. The proportion of single holders among gentry was particularly high in the southern frontier regions, where the government, beginning in the late 16th century, aggressively recruited servitors among peasants and Cossacks. During the 1670s and 1680s, the southern servitors were censused by government agents, and in the process of this revision, single holders were demoted from the gentry to the soldier rank. Later, under Peter the Fern, single holders were given the status of government peasants, that is, free peasants who were not assigned to any gentry. Vodarsky, 1977:62, Vazhinsky, 1983:44. As a result of these changes in status, the gentry stratum was restructured, and its size shrank. In 1651, the gentry servitors numbered 39,000, while in 1700 there were 22,000 to 23,000 gentry landowners and serf owners. An average gentry landowner had 19 peasant households and 60 male serfs. The averages, however, do not reflect the great degree of inequality in land holdings. 47% of gentry were smallholders who owned between 1 and 5 peasant households. On average, they had 2.4 households and 8.8 male souls. By contrast, the wealthiest 464 nobles, 2% of the total, owned 43% of all serfs, with each owning, on average, 355 households and around 1,300 male souls. Vodarsky. 1977, 49, 64, 73. Between 1700 and 1737, the number of gentry estate owners increased from 22,000 to 23,000 to 46,000, while the number of estates some gentry owned more than one estate grew from 29,000 to 63,000. At the same RUSSIA THER OM and OVCYCLE 269. Time population growth was slow during this period, owing to the increased press of state taxes and declining levels of consumption. Thus, the number of elites increased faster than the general population did, and the average size of gentry holdings decreased from 60 to 40 male souls. Vodarsky, 1977-77, Table 8. As a result, gentry incomes also decreased. Faizova, 1999:50. The size of the nobility relative to the general population continued to grow during the last half of the 18th century. Within the constant territory of the first revision, census, the proportion of gentry increased from 0.5% in 1744 to 0.59% in 1762, and then to 0.68% in 1795, Kabuzan 1963, colon 154. The number of peasants per noble landowner declined, while the proportion of impoverished gentrymen increased. At the same time that the numbers of elites grew, so did their consumption levels. Many historians attribute this trend toward more luxurious living to the spread of European influence, or Europeanization. Danilova, 1970, 138, Kamensky, 1999, 290. The total consumption by the elite stratum, therefore, had to increase, either at the expense of peasants or at the expense of the state. The struggle for resources between the elites and the state went on during the reigns of Anne, 1730-40, and Elizabeth, 1741-62. In 1762, the nobility won a signal victory when Peter III abolished the gentry's service obligations to the state. The Gentry Revolution of 1762 resulted in a significant redirection of resources from the state in favor of the elites. This process took the form of declining real taxes. The minting of huge amounts of copper money during the 7 Years' War, 1756-63, resulted in a doubling of grain prices. Because the government was unable to increase the tax rate, which remained the same in nominal terms, real taxes were halved. The light easing of the tax load on the peasants gave the landlords an opportunity to increase quitrents, figure 9.5. By 1794, inflation had eroded the state's exactions on the peasants to 1/4 the level of the first half of the 18th century, figure 9.5. The slack was apparently taken up by increased quitrents. Data on the growth of Kitron and Corvée are available for only a few estates, one of which is fortunately the huge Yuhotskaya estate of the Sheremetevs. An other, although indirect indication of the growth of quitrents on private estates is provided by the increasing quitrents imposed on the state peasants. The government-imposed quitrent probably increased in parallel with the quitrent of gentry-owned peasants, although at a lower level, Chechelin, 1906, 121. Thus, it is likely that the Yuhotskaya estate data reflect a typical pattern of quitrent increase for other gentry estates. The same trend was also identified by Mironov, 1992, Table 6. The data plotted in Figure 9.5 thus suggest that until the 1750s, the curves of per capita taxes due to the state and rents due to the landowners, Chapter 9, 270. Figure 9.5 Dynamics of per capita state taxes and quitrents in the Central Region, Nefedov 2005. The data on quitrents in the gentry estates come from the Yuhotskaya estate, moved in parallel. During the second half of the century, the curves diverged. As the proportion of the peasant surplus going to the state decreased, it was not the peasant who profited, but the lord. In fact, the economic and legal conditions of peasants worsened during this period. The Manifest of 1762 was the final step that turned the peasant into the property of the gentry. Belyaev, 1903, 283. The end result of this process was the famine of 1787 to 88, which forced the landlords to reduce the quitrent in real terms. Figure 9.5. Paul I, 1796 to 1801, reacted to the worsening peasant conditions by limiting bashina to 3 days a week. He also attempted to reimpose on the nobility the obligation to military service. These initiatives triggered another conflict between the state and the elites, which ended with a coup d'etat in which Paul was assassinated. The crisis of the early 17th century weakened the state power and led to the collapse of the tax system. The re-establishment of government control was one of the most important tasks for the new dynasty. However, an attempt to increase taxes during the 1620s ran into resistance from both peasants and gentry because higher state taxes had to come RUSSIA, THER, OM and OVCYCLE 271. Figure 9.6 State taxes on serfs in pods of grain per capita, Nefedov 2005, at the expense of the rent. The gentry bombarded the government with collective petitions, Chelobitnaye, and the government had to retreat. Veselovsky, 1916, 488 to 993. Higher taxes were rescinded not only on the lands that were worked by the state peasants, which were located mainly in the north and on the Vyatka River. The overall taxation level was mainly determined by the tax rate borne by privately owned serfs. In the 1670s, this level was quite low, figure 9.6. During the second half of the century, the taxation rate grew, reaching 0.8 puds per soul, but it was still far below the burden that the peasants bore during the time of Ivan IV, 1.7 puds per capita. In other words, during the 17th century, the state was unable to recover the taxation ability it had before the 1570s. A dramatic redistribution of resources from the peasants and elites to the state was achieved only as a result of the reforms of Peter I, 1682 to 1725. The capitation tax, Podoshnaya Podat, introduced by Peter I, replaced all previous direct levies. After the stabilization of prices in the 1730s, the capitation and salt taxes added up to 3.9 puds per soul. Compared to the pre-Petrine period, taxes increased 5 to 6-fold, figure 9.6, while the military expenditures increased 2.5-fold, Nefedov, 2005. The high level of state taxes continued during the reigns of Anne, 1730 to 40, and Elizabeth, 1741 to 62. The gentry revolution of 1762, however, redistributed the resources in favor of the elites, as we discussed in the previous section, being unable to compensate for the losses due to inflate CHAPTER 9272. Figure 9.7 Real revenues and expenditures of the state budget per capita of popular tie-in puds of grain. The revenues include direct and indirect taxes, but not state borrowing. Thus, the amount borrowed by the state can be seen on the graph as the difference between expenditures and revenues. The expenditures, however, include interest payments on loans. Data from Pogrebinski, 1953, 93, 95, Belousov, 2000, 40, 40, 42, and Nefedov, 2005, 169. Taillon, Catherine II, 1762 to 96, kept the state finances afloat by printing large amounts of paper money, assignatiae. The result was runaway inflation, and during the reign of Catherine prices increased threefold, compared to the price stability under Anne and Elizabeth. Inflation cut into the real revenues of the state budget, which forced the government to print more money, and so on. This vicious cycle persisted until the reign of Nicholas I, 1825 to 1855. The real per capita taxes were halved during the reign of Catherine, figure 9.7. This was compensated somewhat by the population growth, which increased by 70% during this period. Still, the real state revenues at the beginning of the reign were less than at its end. The financial measures undertaken under Paul the Mill, 1796 to 1801, attempted to compensate for the devaluation of the capitation tax. The tax rate was increased by 26%, from 0.9 to 1.2 puds per soul, but this was still only one-third the taxation rate under Elizabeth. The emperor, however, increased the quitrents of the state peasants by 33 to 66%, depending on the economic development of the province. Thus, peasants in the central region paid to the crown 4.2 puds per soul, while in the Black Earth region, the Romanov cycle 273 region, the rate was higher, 6.7 puds. Overall, the state peasants paid the crown about 5 times as much as privately held serfs, Nefedov 2005. As a result, under Paul, the real state revenues increased from 2.6 to 5 puds of grain per capita. Regional variations. Different parts of the huge Russian Empire inevitably developed at dissimilar rates. The central region was the first one to enter the stagflation phase, which happened in the 1730s to 1740s. The minimal amount of land necessary to support a peasant family during this period was 1 to 1.2 desiatins per capita. Kovalchenko, 1967:264. Data from the crown estates within Moscow province, gubernia, suggest that in many districts, such as Khartunskaya, Selinskaya, and Gzelskaya Volosti, the stocks of land fell to 0.5 to 0.9 desiatins per capita. Volkov, 1959:22. The Superintendent of Crown Properties. Baron Rosen wrote that peasants of Moscow province were short of bread due to insufficient land and poor soils. Volkov, 1959:22. The crop failure of 1733 caused famine and the flight of peasants. Between 1732 and 1735, 1/10 of the peasants fled from the crown villages of Moscow province. There was another famine in 1742 to 43. The administration of crown estates took steps to solve the problem of overpopulation by moving peasants to Voronezh province. 14,000 were resettled in 1745. Despite these efforts, there was not enough land for all peasants, and 1/7 of households had neither horses nor cows. Aleferenko, 1958:38, Volkov, 1959, 23:40, Indova, 1964, 100 to 101. Recurrent famines and peasant flight from the central region kept its population at a constant level of 4.5 million between 1719 and 1744, while the population of the provinces of Vladimir, Yaroslavl, and Nizhny Novgorod actually declined. Scarcity of land, recurrent famines, and population stagnation all suggest that the central region was in the stagflation phase at this point. The arrival of stagflation was hastened by the tax increases under Peter I. Whereas previously a peasant household could subsist on 1 desiatin per capita, higher taxes tipped it below a sustainable level. The conditions of stagflation compelled an economic restructuring of the central region. First, the paucity of land resulted in a massive substitution of labor obligations, barshina or corvée, with money obligations, obrok or quitrent. By the 1780s, the great majority of peasants in the central region, 62%, were switched from corvée to quitrent. Rubinstein, 1957:101. The transition to cash quitrents gave the peasants an incentive to practice crafts and trades. Up to 2/3 of peasants in Moscow district, Uezd, supplemented agriculture with such pursuits. Because serfs were bound to land and could not migrate to towns, crafts and trades developed in industrial villages. These rural craftsmen had to CHAPTER 9274. Buy imported grain to feed their families. Thus, the economic system that evolved in the central region during the 18th century was dependent on interregional grain trade. In other words, the continuing existence of population in the central region would have been impossible without the rise of grain plantations in the recently colonized Black Earth region. The Black Earth region became the granary of Russia, while the central region specialized as an industrial region. While population in the central region stagnated, in the Black Earth region it continued to grow and by the end of the century exceeded that of the central region. Kabuzan, 1971, Appendix 2. The southern landowners encouraged peasant immigration by offering reduced quitrents. Prince A. D. Menshikov required quitrents of only 2 to 3 puds per capita. Troitsky, 1968, 125. This low level of quitrents persisted in the southern parts of the Black Earth region, the provinces of Voronezh and Kursk, until the 1760s. The peasants there cultivated large plots of land, around 2.5 desyatins per capita, and even hired seasonal labor migrants from the central provinces. Rubinstein 1957:252, Milov 1998:205, 213. During the 1720s, before the industrial specialization of the central provinces, the overall volume of trade in grains was 2.5 million puds per year. Rubinstein 1957, 407. In the 1780s, the grain traded on the markets in only two Black Earth provinces, Orlov and Kursk, was 24 million puds. Rubinstein, 1957, 258, 404, Kovalchenko and Milov, 1974, 211-13. The interregional grain market encompassing the Central and Black Earth provinces formed in the 1740s and 1750s. The main transport arteries were rivers flowing north. Kovalchenko and Milov, 1974, 211-13. Evidently, it was the grain import from the south that caused the decline of rye prices in the central region. Between the 1740s and 1750s, prices fell by 20%. Mironov, 1985. 9,2 Stagflation, 1800 bis 1905. Population and economy. Stagflation began in the central provinces of Russia in the mid-18th century, while in the Black Earth region, overpopulation developed much later. Thus, the temporal breakpoint proposed here, 1800, is even more approximate than usual. The economic dynamics of Russia during the first half of the 19th century were reconstructed from the reports of provincial governors. Kovalchenko, 1959. Complete data are available for 38 of the 50 provinces of European Russia. Table 9.1a. These data allow us to estimate the average consumption level of the Russian population simply by R, US, SI, A, THER, OM, and OV, CY, CLE 275. Table 9.1 Dynamics of population numbers, yield ratios, total crop harvested, and per capita consumption during the stagflation phase. Population yield, net yield per export per capita years, million ratio, million pods, capita, puds, consumption, puds. A. Data for 36 of 50 provinces of European Russia, 1802 to 11, 28.83.5696, 24.2, 1841 to 5038.93.58, 21.0, 1851 to 6042.73.4806, 18.9. B. Data for the 50 provinces of European Russia, 1851 to 6058.43.41 thousand, 107, 19.0, 1.0, 18.0, 1861 to 7062, 0.13.511, 1919.2, 1.6, 17.6, 1871 to 8069.63.913992, 0.13.416.71881, 9079.84.31690, 21.24.816.41,891 to 1,901, 91.8, 5.0, 2084, 22.74.8, 17.9, 1900-10, 108.15.4261 24.2, 5.6, 18.6. Source: data for 36 of 50 provinces. A. From Kovalchenko, 1959. Data for the 50 provinces of European Russia. B. From Nefedov, 2005. Note: for the period before 1850, data are available only on 36 of the 50 European provinces of Russia. Per capita consumption, last column, for the period after 1850 is calculated by subtracting grain exports from the net crops. Dividing the net production of crops per year by the number of people. This approach works until 1850, because grain export up until that date was negligible in comparison to the total production, 2.7 million puds per year in 1841 to 45, or about 2% of the total. As population increased during the first half of the 19th century, Table 9.1a, personal consumption declined from a high level near 24 puds to a level below 19 puds per capita. In other words, we see here the classic Malthusian mechanism in action. population growth overtaking increases in production, resulting in falling rates of consumption per capita. The population growth rate also declined from 0.91% per annum in 1795 to 1833 to 0.58% in 1834 to 50 and 0.49% in 1850, 1851 to 57, calculated from data in Kabuzan, 1963, Table 17. During the first 2 decades after the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, the economy of Russia entered a period of deep restructuring. One of the important drivers of the change was the building of railroads that connected interior provinces with seaports and international trade. The average export of grain in early 1840 was 27 million puds per annum, but by the late 1880s it had become 257 million, or 23% of the net grain production in the whole of Russia. Pokrovsky, 1947, 251, 317-18. The second important trend was the growing agricultural productivity. Yield ratios increased from 3.4 to 5.4 between 1850 and 1910. Table 9.1b. CHAPTER 9276. The third trend was the continuing population growth. Table 9.1b. From the point of view of personal consumption levels, the three trends essentially cancelled each other. As we see in Table 9.1b, the level of personal consumption slightly declined toward the 1880s and then increased. By the early 20th century, it was at about the same level as in the mid-19th century. In other words, the gains of increased agricultural productivity were eaten up by the combined effects of population growth and grain exports. This informal argument is supported by the quantitative model, based on empirically determined parameters, for the dynamics of carrying capacity in the 50 provinces of European Russia between 1850 and 1910. Nefedov, 1973. Tables 23, 28, 40, 47. Nefedov, 2005, 253 to 254. The Statistical Economic Department of the Food Supplies Ministry calculated in 1918 that the minimal level of grain consumption needed to support a household, including food for people and supplementary forage for the domestic animals, was 18.7 puds per year. Lisinski, 1918, 23-28. Although domestic animals required less grain during the second half of the 19th century than in 1918, more land was available for pasture and haying. It still seems reasonable to conclude that during the second half of the 19th century, personal consumption fell to or below the minimal sustainable level, Table 9.1b. Furthermore, the numbers in Table 9.1b represent averages that hide important heterogeneities in the peasant condition, resulting from both growing economic inequality and temporal variation in yields due to climate fluctuations. Even B.N. Mironov, who argued for a more optimistic view of peasant conditions around 1900 than most Russian historians, estimated that 30% of the peasantry was chronically malnourished. Mironov, 2002, 37. This proportion must have increased during the periods of crop failure. The effect of the great reforms on the peasants. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 dramatically reduced the demands of landowners on the peasants, because the quitrent was substituted with much smaller redemption payments, payments that peasants owed their former owners as compensation for the land. On the negative side, however, former serfs lost part of the land they worked prior to the reforms. In the Black Earth region, the average amount of land held by peasants was reduced from 1.54 to 1.28 desiatins per capita. This plot included non-arable land used for pasture, haymaking, etc. The arable part was about 1 desiatin per capita, which yielded at the time 14 puds of grain, not enough to support even one person, and peasants had to pay redemption payments and taxes. The economic position of the state peasants, however, was much better than that of the former serfs. In the Black Earth region, the former state peasants owned an average of 2.4 desiatins of land per capita. However, RUSSIA, THER, and OVCYCLE 277. Table 9.2 Social structure of the Russian peasantry, 1600 to 1900. Years wealthy, middle poor, 1,600 to 1,750, 1553-32, 1,751 to 1,800, 1048-42, 1,801 to 1,860, 1656-30, 1,896 to 2,000, 1823-59. Source: Mironov, 1985, Table 6. Note: wealth is estimated by the number of houses, with the poorest having 0 to 1, the middle category 2, and the wealthy more than 2. The table shows the percentage in each class at each date. The continuing population growth during the post-reform period eroded land possessions of even the state peasants. Between 1877 and 1905, the average amount of land per household decreased from 15.1 to 12.5 desiatins. Former serfs fared even worse. Their average landholdings decreased from 8.9 to 6.7 desiatins. Thus, the post-reform Russian peasantry stratified into two groups that were comparable in size. The former state peasants were relatively well off, while the former serfs started at a serious disadvantage, and most were destined for poverty. In addition, rapid population growth during the second half of the 19th century under the conditions of stagflation was a potent force driving increased economic inequality, Table 9.2. Thus, though the average level of consumption may have stayed at approximately the same level, a growing proportion of peasants were poor and led a precarious existence. An even more dangerous factor was the temporal variability in yields, especially when several poor years came one after another, Wheatcroft, 1991. Between 1870 and 1914, there were two such periods in Russia, in 1889 to 92 and 1905 to 8, figure 9.8. The famine of 1891, following a sequence of poor harvest years that exhausted grain stores, caused 400,000 fatalities. Robbins, 1975, 171. The poor harvest during 1905 to 7 were one of the triggers of the revolution. Urbanization. Between 1863 and 1914, the proportion of the population living in towns increased from 9.9% to 14.4%, Table 9.3. The industrial provinces located in the central and northwestern regions, however, urbanized at a much more rapid rate than the agrarian provinces, located mostly in the Black Earth region. CHAPTER 9278. Figure 9.8 per capita consumption of grain in European Russia, estimated by subtracting grain exports from net yields. Nefedov, 2005. Table 9.3 Urbanization in Russia between 1863 and 1914. Region 186-318-971914. Industrial provinces 14.1, 21.5, 25.0. Agrarian provinces 8.3, 10.0, 10.3. All European Russia 9.9, 12, 0.9, 14.4. Elites. As we discussed earlier, the proportion of nobles in the total population increased during the 18th century. This process continued during the next century. Tables 9.4 and 9.5. The majority of the nobility were petty gentry who had few or even no peasants. The government was concerned about this noble proletariat and took steps to reduce their number. Nicholas I, 1825-55, issued an edict in accordance with which Impov. Heirish gentry were reclassified as single holders or state peasants. As a result, the numbers of petty gentry declined substantially in the 2 decades following 1838. The social structure of territories formerly with Poland-Lithuania, which was annexed in the late 18th century, was quite different. Within Russia proper, in 1795, there were 112,000 male nobles, while in the annexed territories the Slakta numbered 251,000. There were only RUSSIA, THEROM, and OVCYCLE 279. Table 9.4 Numbers of nobility, males only, in European Russia, in the constant territory within the borders of 1772, 1782 to 1858. Nobles, personal nobles, nobles per total, serfs year thousands, population, percent per noble. 178, 284, 0.6, 476, 179, 5112, 0.7764, 1816, 156, 66, 0.9248, 183, 4166, 0.8052, 185, 190, 0.8, 245, 1858, 21, 1894, 0.8439. Source: Kabuzan, 1971b, Tables 1 through 3. Table 9.5 Numbers of hereditary nobles in Russia, 1858 to 1897. Nobles' average estate size, desiatins. Year, thousands. Black Earth region. 1-858-23-418-703-051761897478104. Source: Karelin, 1979:40 292-93. Note: the numbers given are for the 41 provinces of European Russia, excluding the 9 western provinces that were part of Poland-Lithuania, because in these provinces the Szlachta was a very high proportion of the population. 14 peasants per noble in Poland-Lithuania, while in Russia the ratio was 64-1. The petty Polish nobility took the land away from peasants on a massive scale, compensating them with monthly payments of grain that were barely enough to survive on. One government report noted that the misery of the serfs is extraordinary. Peasants, especially those belonging to petty landlords, find themselves in calamitous and oppressed conditions. Cited in Shapukova, 1959-132. The numerical growth of the noble estate was not the only reason for the increased demands on the peasants. Exposure of the Russian nobles to European fashions after the Napoleonic Wars fueled the rise of conspicuous consumption. The content analysis of several dozen memoirs suggests that the lifestyle of 4/5 of the large landowners could be described as one of conspicuous luxury, aggressive, unrestrained luxury, ostentatious splendor, or extravagance. Poorer gentry attempted to follow the luxury standards set by their betters, with disastrous consequences for their finances. Smatina, 2003, 58, 60-61. CHA PTER 9280. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 resulted in a sharp redistribution of resources from the nobility to the peasants. The quitrent and corvée were replaced with redemption payments and state taxes. Although the freed serfs were compelled to rent land from the gentry, because most did not have enough of their own, on balance, the revenues of the former serf holders suffered. The emancipation of the serfs caused serious dislocations for the land. Owners who specialized in producing grain for the market, especially those who relied on corvée labor. Many were unable to adapt to the new conditions and failed. Between 1862 and 1877, the number of gentry-owned estates contracted by 11,000, or 8.4% of the total. 12% of the land held by nobility was lost to other social estates, soslovia. The nobles sold 21% of their lands in the central region and 12% in the Black Earth region. The estates belonging to ruined gentry were bought by the merchants and the petty bourgeois. Karelin, 1979, 56-57. The nobility understood that it could not reverse the reforms, so it demanded other kinds of reparations from the state. One such compensation could be an aristocratic constitution that would transfer part of the power of the monarchy to the nobility. Sladkovich, 1962-76, Christoforov, 2047. An 1862 report to the emperor by the Minister of Internal Affairs, P.A. Valuev, stated that the nobility aims at a certain degree of participation in the administration. Until their objectives are to a certain extent satisfied, there will be neither peace nor truce. Valuev, 1958-143. Eventually, the government was forced to make concessions and created a system of self-government, zemstvo, in the provinces, guberni, and the districts, uezdi. P.A. Valuev wrote in his diary that the court used the establishment of the zemstvo as a means to avoid having a constitution foisted upon them. Valuev, 1961:241. Zemstvo councils were elective organs whose members were selected separately from 3 classes: the landowners, the townspeople, pool, and the peasants. The nobles, however, played the dominant role. 85% of members of the provincial assemblies in 1865-67 came from the nobles and merchants. Zemstvo assemblies assigned and gathered local taxes. However, Zemstvo self-government was limited to economic issues, while matters of law and order remained within the purview of the provincial governors. Another way in which impoverished nobles could compensate for the falling revenues from the land was through government service. Education provided credentials that gave an advantage in the competition for the jobs, so the gentry youth entered the colleges and universities en masse. Laikina Svirskaya, 1971, 56-57, Karelin, 1979-96. About half of the students in the middle schools and the universities were the children of nobles and government officials. most students were very poor. A combination of RUSSIA, THER, and OVCYCLE281. Abject poverty and exposure to new social ideologies from Western Europe, such as Marxism, radicalized the students. Likina Svirskaya, 1971, Brauer, 1975, 230. Between 1860 and 1880, the number of students in the middle schools increased from 17,800 to 69,200, while the number of university students grew from 4,100 to 14,100. Likina Svirskaya, 1971:51-57. This period saw the formation of a new social stratum, the intelligentsia, which grew together with the expansion of education. The elite overproduction was the most important process underlying the formation of the intelligentsia, half of which had personal roots in the noble estate. The state was unable to find employment for all gymnasium and university graduates. Whereas the number of students increased fourfold, the size of the government bureaucracy increased by only 8%, from 119,000 to 129,000. Even if we add to this number the 52,000 new Zemstvo positions, it is still evident that only a minority of elite aspirants could be employed. Faced with poor employment prospects, many students found the alternative pursuits, such as revolutionary activity, an attractive option. Bergman, 1983-11. 61% of the revolutionaries of the 1860s, the nihilists, were students or recent graduates, and an even larger proportion, 70%, were children of nobles or officials. Likina Svirskaya, 1971, 298, 302. A decade later, the revolutionaries were still heavily recruited from the elite strata. Out of 1,665 radicals who were arrested in 1873 to 79, 28.2% were nobles, 16.5% were clergy, and 13.4% were military. Only a minority were of peasant origin, 13.5%, and the same proportion were petty bourgeois. 38% of the leadership of the radical Popular Will organization had noble origins, 10% came from the clergy, and 7% from the merchant estate. 2/3 of these professional revolutionaries studied in the university, but half of those failed to graduate because of lack of money or anti-government activity. Ittenberg, 1965:374. During the post-reform period, the process of noble impoverishment continued apace. The government attempted to slow down this process by offering subsidized credits to the gentry. Despite this aid, the amount of land owned by the nobility continued to shrink. Table 9.6. At the same time, the numbers of personal nobles doubled. Table 9.5. Between 1877 and 1905, the proportion of petty gentry increased from 50 to 59% of the total. These petty noblemen owned tiny parcels of land, on average 30 desiatins, or not much larger than the land owned by well-off peasants. The Special Commission of 1892 noted that these estates could hardly serve as sufficient means of supporting the level of consumption that was expected by this social stratum. Soslovy. Solovev, 1979, 205. CHAPTER 9282. Table 9.6. Total amount of land owned by the nobility in Russia, 1861 to 1905. Year desiatins, million. 186,177.8, 187,773.1189, 257.7190553.2. Source: Solovev, 1979:200. The state. An important trend during the first half of the 19th century was the weakening of the influence of the nobility on the state. Mironov, 2000. Nicholas I, 1825 to 1855, resuscitated the policies of Paul I, 1796 to 1801, and attempted to re-establish a centralized bureaucratic apparatus. One reflection of the increasing power of the state was the growth of the crown revenues, figure 9.7. In real terms, the revenues per capita of population increased from 5.2 to 7.6 puds. The government was unwilling or unable to increase direct taxes on the serfs, and instead relied on indirect taxes and increased rents on the state peasants. The growth of revenues permitted the state to maintain the high level of military expenditures that was reached during the Napoleonic Wars. In 1833, Russia was the most powerful European state, with an army of 860,000, or 1.43% of the total population, compared to 0.83% under Catherine II. However, the Industrial Revolution, which gathered steam in northwestern Europe after 1800, transformed the balance of forces within Europe. The result was a defeat in the Crimean War, 1853–56, which forced Russia into social reforms. The most important task was the emancipation of the serfs, because the war resurrected the elite fears of a peasant uprising at a time when the state's attention was concentrated on prosecuting the war. Grand Duke Constantine, after reading de Tocqueville's book on the French Revolution, remarked, "If we do not carry out a peaceful and complete revolution with our own hands, it will inevitably happen without us and against us." Drew Ginin, 1946:536. His brother Alexander II, 1855–81, expressed the same sentiment in his address to the Moscow nobility. "We live in such an age that it will happen sooner or later. I think you are of the same mind as me. It would be better to begin to abolish the serfdom from above than to wait until it abolishes itself from below." Golos, 1916, 393. In the end, the Great Reform of 1861 was successful in reducing the social tensions well redis, tributing resources from the nobility to the peasantry and the state. RUSSIA THER OHM AN OVCY CLE 283. Emancipation of the serfs allowed the state to increase taxes, including the capitation tax on the former serfs, something the government was unable to do previously because of resistance from the nobility. In 1861–67, the capitation tax increased almost twofold. In 1863, the government introduced the real estate tax on urban properties. In 1872, it started taxing the land of the nobility. Although this land tax was not initially very large, its introduction marked the end of an important noble privilege, freedom from direct taxation. Despite these and other tax increases, the state revenues stayed practically flat in real terms because of rapid inflation, figure 9.7. The changing geopolitical environment required from Russia a rearmament of the army and huge investments in new industries and railroads. The conditions of stagflation meant, however, that the state was chronically short of financial resources and was forced to borrow heavily. Between 1861 and 1880, the government borrowed more than 1.6 billion rubles. As a result, in 1885–95, the interest on the loans exceeded 40% of the government budget, that is, twice the amount spent on the military. Intensifying geopolitical competition forced the government to take further steps to increase its revenues. Between 1887 and 1890, the new Minister of Finances, E. A. Vishnegradsky, increased customs tolls and indirect taxes, which allowed him to raise the tax burden on the population to a new level figure, 9.7. In 1897, the state monopoly on alcohol production was imposed, which yielded a quarter of revenues during 1900 to 1903. After 1890, real taxes exceeded and stayed above the level of 10 puds per capita, figure 9.7, which allowed the government to more than double the milli. Dairy expenditures from 210 million rubles in the 1880s to 490 million rubles in 1900 to 1903. Sociopolitical instability. The growing demands on the serfs during the first half of the 19th century met with increasing peasant resistance, figure 9.9. The great majority of disturbances occurred on the gentry-owned estates, reflecting the growing difference in the social and economic conditions between serfs and state peasants. According to the data examined by V. A. Fedorov, 59% of disturbances in the central region were caused by the new impositions on the peasants, such as increased quitrent or corvée, dispossession of land, and harsh punishments. A change in owner caused 20% of disturbances because it was often associated with worsening peasant conditions, or it raised hopes of emancipation. Some landlords made such provisions in their wills. Another 15% resulted from rumors of emancipation by the Tsar's decree. CHAPTER 9284. Figure 9.9 Dynamics of peasant disturbances. Data for 1796 to 1856 and 1881 to 1900 are from Litvak, 1967, Table 1. For 1855 to 60 from Zayonchkovsky, 1963, and for 1890 to 1916 from Dubrovsky, 1956. Note the logarithmic scale of the y-axis. In an average year, only 0.3% of peasants in the central region took part in such actions. Litvak 1967:46. However, the massive eruptions that occurred in 1797, 1812, 1826, and 1848, figure 9.9, caused much concern among government officials who were afraid that the accumulated social pressure could find an outlet in a general peasant uprising. The main cause of the unrest in 1796 to 97 was the peasant expectations of serfdom abolition that had been raised by the reforms of Paul the Firm. In 1826, similarly, the peasants hoped for changes following the beginning of the new reign of Nicholas I. When instead the peasants were confronted with rising rents, rioting affected some of the largest noble estates with thousands of serfs. For a while, the noble landlords were afraid the disturbances would grow into a second Pugachev rising. Litvak 1967-46, Rahmatulin 1990-01, 69-70. Another high point of peasant rioting occurred in 1848. Several factors played a role, including famine and a cholera pandemic. There were also emancipation rumours triggered by the 1847 decree that allowed peasants to buy their freedom when an estate was sold because of debt. The final factor was the European revolutions of 1848. When all these factors combined, the result was the disturbance peak of 1848, Rahmatulin 1990, 58, 19, 198. The increasing pressure from continuing peasant rioting and agitation was an important factor in the decision of Alexander II, 1855 to 1881, to free the serfs. An 1857 report of the Third Department of His Majesty's Own, RUSSIA, THEROMANOVCYCLE 285. Figure 9.10 Dynamics of Criminality in Russia as the number of total crimes per 100,000 persons. Mironov 2000:2, Table 5.6. Chancery, the political police, pointed out that the peasantry was in an agitated state as a result of the rumours of imminent emancipation and that massive unrest was likely. This is precisely what happened next year. Figure 9.9. In the post-reform period, the number of peasant disturbances declined, although there were unrest peaks toward the end of the century, usually associated with the ascent of a new emperor that raised peasant hopes for a land reform. The fathers and sons cycles. Although the demographic structural pressures grew steadily during the 19th century, socio-political instability increased not monotonically, but in waves, with a period of roughly 2 generations, 40 to 60 years. Instability grew during the liberal reigns of Alexander I, 1801 to 25, and Alexander II, 1855 to 1881, and declined during the conservative reigns of Nicholas I, 1825 to 1855, and Alexander III, 1881 to 1994, as can be seen in, for example, the crime statistics, figure 9.10. We lack direct estimates of revolutionary activity during the 19th century. However, capital punishment in Tsarist Russia was reserved for the most serious political crimes. Thus, the number of executions per year provides a useful indication of revolutionary activity. To be more precise, the number of executions should be proportional to the product of Revolu CHAPT ER 9286. Table 9.7 Number of named executions, see text, per time period, 1811 to 1917. Period executions. A. Executions per decade, 1811 to 1904, 1811 to 20, 0, 1821 to 3011, 1,800, 31 to 41,800, 41 to 53,851 to 60, null et otta sex et till shutio shutten et otta shu et till ottio, tvortvor 1,881 to 90, 30, 1,891 to 2,000, 0, 1,900, 1 to 4, a 0.0. B. Executions per year, 1905 to 1917, 1905, 175, 1906, 1116, 1907, 631, 1908, 712, 1909, 243, 1910, 72, 1911 to 1917, 8.1b. Sources: A. Gurnett, 1907, B. Usharovich, 1933. A. The 4 years before the revolution of 1905 to 7, B. Annual average for the period, pioneering activity, and the intensity of the government efforts to suppress it. Table 9.7 shows the temporal distribution of named executions, that is, executions of persons whose names were known to the compilers of executions lists. This statistic is an underestimate of the total number of executions, but this is not a problem for our purposes, because we are interested in the relative dynamics of this index. The intensity of revolutionary struggle, as indicated by the number of executions, shows two peaks during the 19th century, followed by another one in the early 20th, tables 9.6a and 9.6b. The first and rather mild upheaval of the 19th century occurred during the 1820s. The Decembrist Rising in 1825, an elite-led military